Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're here every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific time. And we talk about business doctrine, the leadership and philosophies of great military personalities, as well as military history, all by way of distilling from that lessons we can use in our businesses and professional careers. And so today, I'm very happy to introduce you to what you described yourself as my long lost brother, I think, right?
Yeah, a brother from another mother.
Yeah. Remember who Twin Sons of Different Mothers? Remember that was an album. Tim Weisberg, I think, and Dan Fogelberg or something like that.
That's pretty old, dude. Like, I'm more a Led Zeppelin guy.
Okay. So my brother Josh Yager, who currently lives in Santa Barbara, California, which, as we were talking about before we started the show, is where I grew up. So we were, I was talking about various streets and that sort of thing. So it's a bit of a nostalgia wave here as well. So Josh is as I described him in some of the social media posts, he's a scholar on the career of Ulysses S. Grant, the general and president during the Civil War era in this country. And when I learned that about Josh, I said, I've got to have you on the show and have you talk about U.S. Grant's experience as both a war and a political leader, and how can we apply that to the business world. So without any more ado, I'm gonna turn things over to Josh and let him talk about that. He's got some fascinating ideas.
Kevin, you're generous calling me a scholar of Grant. I think it would be more apt to say I'm a fan of Grant.
Okay.
And so I think there's incredible lessons to be learned from that guy, way more than we could cover in this. Somebody should probably write a book, not me. I want to focus on the Vicksburg Campaign, which Grant had, and just by way of background, we're in the end of 1862 at this point. Grant's had a couple of good successes in the West. So he's come to the attention of leadership in Washington as a guy that can handle good offensive strategy. But militarily and politically, it is a bad time at the end of 62. Lincoln had just lost control of the House and the Senate, so the Republicans were out and they had a Republican president, but the Democrats were in. The Democrats were arguing for, hey, look, we're not really in this for as long as it takes, as much money as it takes, like total war. Let's kind of seed the battle lines where we're at. There hadn't been really any significant military successes in 62. So Grant and during this time, the U.S., the Federals had control of almost the whole Mississippi, except for this little 50-mile stretch around the city of Vicksburg. And why Vicksburg was so important was that all of the resources that the Confederacy needed were moving from the West, from Texas and Louisiana, into the South. So all of the beef, all of the salt, all of the sugar, all of the molasses, the things that you need ultimately to feed the troops, which is the only way to win a war, came west to east, and it went through Vicksburg. And the problem with Vicksburg is most of the Mississippi is very low delta area, floodlands. And at this bend, there's this like huge tower of earth. So the edges of the Mississippi and Vicksburg have like 50 or 100-foot cliffs in front of them, and they had put hundreds of guns up there. So the North couldn't get control of the rail line that crossed at Vicksburg, which means they couldn't cut off the supply, which means they couldn't beat the South until they got Vicksburg. So that's where we are geopolitically. Geographically, think of it this way: if you imagine a clock, Vicksburg is at the center of the clock where the hands are.
Mm-hmm.
And 6 o'clock at the bottom is New Orleans, and 12 o'clock at the top is Memphis. Memphis is where the North had their headquarters at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So they're trying to get from 12 o'clock down to the center of the clock to take Vicksburg. Okay. Lincoln says, Grant, I need you to do this. It's a hard task. You got to do it. We're in deep trouble if we can't cut these guys off. And politically, I don't think I'm going to win the presidency in 2 years unless we start to get some momentum. So Grant says, okay, let's get after it. He grabs his right-hand guy, Sherman, and says, Sherman, here's what we're going to do. We're going to split the army. You're going to go from like 10 o'clock on the clock towards the center, towards Vicksburg. I'm going to go from 2 o'clock on the clock towards the center at Vicksburg, and we're going to get him in kind of a pincer move. Mm-hmm. So from the very beginning, everything goes wrong. Sherman goes down and attacks Vicksburg at a battle called Chickasaw Bayou, and he gets his head handed to him. It's swampland. He can't unload the transport troops. It's raining. The guys at Vicksburg got notice ahead of time that he was coming, so they had all the guns and all the guys ready to kick his butt. Mm-hmm. And Grant, moving from 2 o'clock towards Vicksburg, gets his supply lines cut that are behind him. So he's moving down, and his entire supply lines at Holly Spring get taken. So he's got no communication with Sherman, he's got no communication with Washington, and he's got no food. So adding to the complexity, there's another general called McClernand, who is a political appointee. He was a senator. He was on the guys again. He was a Democrat, so he was against Lincoln. He was the one saying, look, let's just settle this thing and draw a line in the sand, let the South do its thing. Mm-hmm. And he hated Grant, and Grant hated him. And so Grant's got a bad team. He's out of communication with everybody. It's the highest level of floods that there can be. His right-hand guy, Sherman, just gets his butt kicked. And it's right at the kickoff of the war. This is December of 62. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the lessons learned for me in this is Grant decided, look, it's going bad quickly. And everyone was telling him, pull back. Let's go back to Memphis. This isn't going to work. Let's try it again in the summer. And Grant says, no, I'm going to go to the front, because he was back in Memphis directing traffic. And for me, one of the great takeaways is when things get really bad, the CEO has got to get his boots on and go to the front line to figure out what the hell's going on here and start making tactical decisions. Usually the CEO is higher up, making the strategic high-level things. But there are times when, for the good of the business, for the good of the clients, for the good of the force in the field, the general's got to be on the front line, kicking ass and taking names. And I think that's Grant was notoriously good at that. That was his preference, was to be at the front. And I think that's certainly one of the reasons he was such an incredibly successful CEO, if you will, the force in the field.
So it's interesting because in the well, it's not recent, but last year the Howard Schultz turned over as CEO of Starbucks to his replacement, and I don't want to pronounce the fellow's name because I'll mangle it. But the first thing that his replacement did is he spent, I think, 2 or 3 months training as a barista and learning all about the day-to-day operations and what all of the frontline people are doing, so he could understand the problems, because Starbucks had some really bad problems. They're still dealing with them.
Yeah,
trying to get themselves back on track. And to his credit, he didn't sit in Seattle and just sort of dictate from here or there. He literally rolled his sleeves up, and he went through the same kind of training that a brand new barista would go through, and locations throughout the country, so we could also get a sense of how are things different from kind of region to region.
Yeah, that's spot on. Another example is Elon Musk spins up the Gigafactory in Nevada. They're not producing the units that they need to produce. Nobody can figure out why.
Mm-hmm.
He and his brother and cousin go there with cots and sleeping bags and sleep on the production floor for 8 weeks and are just like relentless. It's a 24-hour gnarly gig where many CEOs forget how they got there and might over delegate. And at the end of the day, if it's somebody else's, if you're responsible for the capital or you're responsible for the men, you got to get dirty. You got to go to the front and you got to make the decisions. And you can't do it remotely.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we got Grant and his crew. It's in a mess. It's the highest flood levels on record on the Mississippi. By the way, so we've got you've heard of the Mississippi Bayou. So we've got the Mississippi River that goes from 12 o'clock to 6 o'clock from Illinois all the way down to Louisiana. But it's not like a nice, clean, fat river. It floods. So there's about 100 square miles that's underwater at this point. So they're like walking on little raised levees. They're floating boats across things that used to be fields. It's gnarly. But we finally get to the beginning of January, and Grant and McClernand and Sherman are all on the west bank across from Vicksburg. So they can finally see it. Finally, after a month of slogging and a month of bad outcomes, they get to where they're supposed to be. And then it's like, well, how the hell are we going to take this place? Because we got 100-foot bluffs with all of these guns, and like we got to get across this enormous waterway. So Grant, in his memoirs, talks about that's when we started to experiment. So these guys did crazy things for 4 months. One thing they said is, well, maybe we can divert the Mississippi. So they started to cut a channel a mile long, hoping that the Mississippi would go into this channel and allow them to slip through the new channel that they cut so they could get south of Vicksburg and attack it from the south, which was the weak point in the city. So Grant had 4,000 guys digging trenches. And of course, the guys at Vicksburg say, look, I can see what you're doing. They line up their guns and they start killing all these guys as they're digging this 1 mile long trench. So that didn't work. Then Grant sends a bunch of guys way south, 100 miles south, to try to find a river that will allow them to come north and get at Vicksburg. That doesn't work. They end up destroying a bunch of boats, and a bunch of guys get malaria, and it's a 3-month just horrible outcome. They try it from the north on a battle called the Yazoo Pass or Moon Lake, where they say, well, there's this big lake that's 6 miles long, and that links to a river that's 15 miles long, and that links to another river that's 20 miles long. And if we can get all the way down all this series of rivers, we can get at Vicksburg from 3 o'clock going towards Vicksburg from the west, or from the east going west. So they're slogging around, trying all of these different things. And Grant says in his memoirs, I didn't think any of these things would work, but if one of them worked, then we would take advantage of it. But he was okay with starting a campaign without a plan and saying, we're just going to experiment and learn from our experimentation and be okay with failure. And that's the only way to crack the impossible code of how the hell do you take the Gibraltar of the Mississippi. So I think that's an important lesson learned, is that sometimes in leadership in businesses, we get overly linear and we write our business plan for 2024. And if one thing goes wrong, it's like, oh, crap, it's not going to work. Rather than, look, success is about pivoting. We have to be willing to say, hey, student body left, and it might work, it might not work, but do it within reasonable bounds rather than be bound by the business plan that we wrote 2 years ago.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about of all things, a candle company. I think they're based in Ohio. I believe they're called Aileen, and they have a shortage of workers, as a lot of businesses do. And so their plan is to replace workers with automation with robots or whatever.
Mhm.
But they can't figure out how to get the robots to straighten the wicks in the candle, which I guess is an important part of making candles, because otherwise they get buried in the wax or whatever, right?
Right.
And the robots, they break the jars of the candle, all this kind of stuff. And I'm reading this article and I'm thinking to myself, there's got to be a different way to approach this.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of trying to make the automation match humans,
Mm-hmm.
why don't you figure out a way to refigure the manufacturing of your product to do what robots can do?
Right.
Right. And so I've been toying with the idea of sending the CEO of the company an email saying, why don't you build a different kind of wick that can stand up to the wax being poured in, and maybe it's coated with something that after the wax, it is in there hot, it sort of melts away the outer coating on the wick in a way that the wick is still standing up. You don't have to worry about, having anybody straighten it, let alone a robot, or, like try something different than what you're doing. They've been trying to get these robots to work now, I guess, for like a year or something, and it doesn't work. It's sort of like trying the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is
crazy.
The definition of insanity, right?
Yeah. I think a great modern example of the freedom to experiment is Jeff Bezos in Amazon. He had in his annual letter to shareholders, I think it was 2018, it was all about wandering, he calls it, which is really experimentation, and saying, look, we're never going to be great unless we give latitude to each other to take wild bets and fail and expect we're going to fail at them. Obviously, within constraints, we're not going to bet the farm on any of these experiments. Like Grant didn't bet the farm, but he said, look, we're not just going to attack Vicksburg straight on. We have to figure out a way around, but we don't know what the way around is yet. So we got to have 4 or 5 irons in the fire. And I think Bezos is an extraordinary recent example of, hey, you know what? We got all these servers running with our computers to sell stuff online. Maybe somebody else would like to use our computers. So why don't we do Amazon Web Services? And geez, we got all these eyeballs on Prime watching TV and buying stuff from us. What if we did ads? And right now, those experiments are like multi-hundred billion dollar revenue experiments that on their own would be extraordinary businesses. But you never get there if you don't have a CEO that says, hey, I'm open to crazy ideas. If you give me a crazy idea, I'll give you some resources, modest, appropriate, within the context of risk. But let's push it. Well, what you and I don't know is all the experiments that failed, right?
Right.
Because the winners write the history. But I'd love to hear what Bezos' experiments were that they wasted, hundreds of billions of dollars and it didn't work out. But yeah, experimentation is the only way to get great breakthrough, because the current way isn't working, period, end of sentence, full stop. Okay, so we got Grant, we got the Army, they're slogging around doing crazy experiments, none of them are working until nature kind of helped him out. Things started to dry out. He said, okay, finally, we're on the west side of the Mississippi. We could march our army south 50 miles. It's still a lot of wet area, but at least we can get the troops down south below the Mississippi. But we can't get our troops across the Mississippi to the east. So what are we going to do? So they pull this Hail Mary where he marches like 70,000 guys south of Vicksburg, but they're on the wrong side of the freeway. And he sends the gunboats right down in front of the guns of Vicksburg, and the gunboats are pulling equipment and supplies, and they say, "Damn the torpedoes, we're going for it." Couple of gunboats get blasted, but the gunboats make it all the way south, and so now he's got what he wants. He's got his army south of Vicksburg, and he's got the troop transports that can take him across the Mississippi to Vicksburg, and he finally gets everyone on the right side of the battle. Now, this whole thing took a month to get from where across Vicksburg doing the experiment. We're now going to move almost 100,000 guys south with all of the logistics, all of the equipment, all of the resources. And the army is so big that they have break it into 3 parts and have different generals moving the troops down. So everyone's going to be out of communication for 30 days with each other, and they don't have enough supplies, and they're not sure about how successful this running of the Vicksburg guns is going to be. And Grant writes this absolutely incredible set of instructions to all the guys before kickoff. He's basically, we're not going to see each other for 30 days, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong, and we're going to be out of communication with each other. And he writes the Special Order 110, which is included in his memoirs. And when I was reading it, I'm like, holy cow, this guy nailed every contingency. If this, then that. If this, then that. If that, then this. And so he outlined the whole thing for his guys, assuming I'm not going to be able to talk to any of them for 30 days. And they're going to be in a really stressful military environment, very risky. And so I think one of the things that a great leader does is they communicate in writing the if-thens and sets the parameters on, look, you're going to find yourself in hairy situations, and I want to rehearse those with you ahead of time and communicate with you what my expectations are, so that there aren't a lot of guesswork. You know the first principles. You know the objective that we're going for. We want to be south of Vicksburg on the eastern side of the Mississippi. Got it, guys? That's what we're going for. And there may be 15 things that go wrong in this, and I'm going to outline every one of those 15 things and every one of the contingencies of those 15 things. And it was, being a guy that does a lot of writing, I was struck with, man, this guy freaking nailed it. He could imagine the process and the outcome, and he equipped his leaders to have flexibility within appropriate guardrails with first principles in it. So I think being able to communicate in writing to your team what the outcome is and what the process is to get to that outcome, and what things are non-negotiable and what things are free to make your decision. You figure it out. You're empowered to lead towards the outcome.
Yeah. I mean, it's amazing, because nowadays there's all kinds of software to do that and everything, but we're talking over 150 years ago, right?
Yeah.
To be able to hold all that in his head.
Yeah. Yeah. And at the end of the day, I don't think any software can anticipate the contingencies, right? It takes somebody that's been on the battle lines, that's got his butt kicked, that has had failures, to anticipate the failures that his team would have, and to preemptively anticipate those and give them guidance on what to do in response to these things. Like, he was going into details on the distance between hospitals that they will need along the line, and how to collect forage resources, because they were going for 30 days and they had 10 days worth of food. So he said, here's what you got to do. You got to have, this is how you're going to collect food from the people around. Here's what you're not going to do. Here's what you are going to do. Here's where the hospital should be. Here's what happens when your horses get sick. Like, it was gnarly, the level of detail he goes to in this order. So writing, get your writing right.
Yeah. Wow.
So then I think I like reading annual reports from there are a couple of guys that write extraordinarily good annual reports for their shareholders. One's Warren Buffett. Like, if you just read Warren Buffett's annual reports, you should be awarded an MBA at the end. And Jeff Bezos also does that, writes really, really tight annual reports to shareholders, letters to shareholders. A lot can be learned from successful leaders and how they communicate in writing to their teams. Okay, so we finally get south of Vicksburg. We're about 50 miles south of Vicksburg. We finally get all of the guys on the east side of the Mississippi. So Vicksburg is in trouble now. And everyone thinks, okay, this is easy. We're going to go straight north up the Mississippi, and we're going to attack Vicksburg from the south, and we're going to get them. We finally got them trapped. And that's what Pemberton, who is in charge of Vicksburg, is thinking. That's what Sherman, who's in charge of a third of this military division, is thinking. And Of course, Grant says, no, we're not going to do that, because that's what everyone's going to expect. And so what Grant does is, if you're on the clock slightly south of the center of the dial, he goes straight east. Instead of north to Vicksburg, he goes east to Jackson, Mississippi, the state capital. And he does that. And this march, by the way, is about 100-mile march to go east with no supplies in enemy territory where he can't communicate with his other divisions or Washington. And the reason he does that is he says, look, they know that we're going to go north. That's the right thing to do. I'm going east because they won't expect it. And by going east, what I'm going to do is cut off their supply line, because Vicksburg was getting troops moving from the east towards the west to Vicksburg from 3 o'clock Jackson to Vicksburg at the center of the dial. So Grant takes off, moving towards the east with his army. He takes Jackson, Mississippi. He fights 5 battles in like 10 days. These are gnarly campaigns. Starting at Port Gibson, he just gets over the Mississippi. He's got to fight just to get a beachhead. He then goes to the Battle of Raymond as he's fighting towards 3 o'clock towards Jackson. He fights at Jackson, Mississippi, takes the state capital, burns it, and then starts fighting west towards Vicksburg, Battle of Champion Hill. They called it the Hill of Death. It was just a brutal, gnarly campaign. And then the Battle of the Black River. So this is in 17 days. He fights 5 battles, no communication with Washington, and no supplies because they're in the enemy's territory. Sherman, his best right-hand guy, says, you're crazy. You're voluntarily going into the place that our enemy would have fought for a year to get you to that place. And Grant's response was, look, I'm going to fight where they're not. I'm going to attack them where they're not. And I think, there was that book maybe 20 years ago, The Blue Ocean, that talked about if you are developing a business or a service, you have to go where your competition isn't, because that's where the unserved market is. If you just go straight up to Vicksburg, the way everybody does it, you're just making another widget that everyone's got tons of versions of that widget. Everyone knows what you're going to do. It's not going to differentiate you in the market. So we're going to do a student body left and go in a direction that nobody expects us to go. And that willingness to not accept the obvious path to success, but to be willing to consider the unanticipated path to success, is actually the thing that's the most determinative of massive success.
Yeah. So I think the best example of that I can think of is Walt Disney. So when after his first breakthrough character, as probably most people know, was Mickey Mouse, who recently, the early versions of him anyway, recently fell into public domain. And Mickey Mouse was so successful that his bankers wanted him to continue making Mickey Mouse cartoons. Right? More mouse, more mice, more mice. That was like the joke. And he decided, no, he wanted to make this cartoon about skeletons dancing in a cemetery at midnight, and it was called The Skeleton's Dance. And the bankers were like, why do you want to do this? Stick with what everybody's expecting you to do. And Walt Disney was like, no, because we'll do more Mickey Mouse cartoons, but he knew that you would burn yourself out by doing the same thing over and over again. And what's so interesting is, if you look at the Walt Disney Company today, one of the biggest problems I think they have is they bought these big franchises like the Marvel Comics, universe, and they've been making all of these big time, super hero movies, and the revenue from them is just declining because they've saturated the market. Finally, I think Robert Iger has acknowledged that they've made a mistake. They did the same thing with the Star Wars franchise. Is you can't keep making the same stuff over and over again. You have to be willing to change things up and go in a direction that your customers or your clients, they may not even realize they want it until they see it.
Yeah. Steve Jobs is another example. right? Apple makes computers. That's what they do. They make awesome computers.
Right.
They're really user friendly. And then he says,
Mhm.
we're getting into the phone business. And everyone's like, the phone business? Why are we getting in the, what do we know about phones? And then the
Right.
phone business leads to the iPod business, which leads to the music business. And it's like, holy crap, that's a blue ocean that everyone
Right.
expected Apple to go to Vicksburg. Everyone expected Apple to just make another version of the
Mhm.
Mac. And they said, now we have an entirely different idea of how success can be made. And it isn't the thing that you always, that we are typecast in. We're going to do something
Right.
different. And Grant did that routinely in his battles. Okay, so bottom of the Mississippi or below Vicksburg, we go student body east and get Jackson and then fight our way back to Vicksburg. Now we have the siege of Vicksburg. We've locked it down. Nobody can get out. It's going to be a bad scene. We're here for 2 months. There's all sorts of horrible attacks on Vicksburg. There's these incredible mining operations where they're digging underneath the walls of Vicksburg and putting thousands of pounds of dynamite and blowing up the walls. It's like siege warfare is a gnarly thing.
Mhm.
What is striking to me about the siege of Vicksburg is the siege of Vicksburg is not what Grant's natural inclination was. What
Mhm.
Grant did, what he was brilliant at, was maneuver warfare, moving
Mhm.
his troops to a place where the enemy was and getting around the corner and attacking them from the side. So movement is what made Grant great. And at the
Right.
Battle of Vicksburg, Grant had to become somebody that he wasn't naturally good at, which is a siege warfare guy. A whole new
Mhm.
set of tactics that Grant has never done before, other than when he was a lieutenant in the Mexican American War, and they have the siege at Mexico City. But like he had never led troops on a siege like this, but he understood. Look, I got to do something that I'm not comfortable doing in order to
Mhm.
win this battle. I have to take the hat off that comes most natural to me and put on a hat that isn't. And
Mhm.
he seamlessly moved into a general of maneuvering arms to a siege general. And they ended up
Mhm.
succeeding. July 3rd, Vicksburg falls. Day before, Battle of Gettysburg is won. And in
Mhm.
4th of July, everyone's stoked about it. And it turns the direction of the war because Grant was able to change who he was in response to the environment. And
Mhm.
I think many business leaders, it's uncomfortable to become somebody that we're not naturally inclined to. But the great
Yeah.
leaders are able to take off the shell that made them successful and put on a new set of armor that it is not does not come naturally to them. Say, look, I got to do it for the good of the troops, and they
Yeah.
figure it out.
So a lot of business coaches, this has been, I think, a more recent thing. Um, they will they will preach, well, you need to play to your strengths. So what you're good at, just sort of
Yep.
double down on that, right?
Yep.
And that's what's going to bring you success. And while I think there's perhaps some validity there, the problem is what do you do when your strength is just not the right, arrow in the quiver, right?
Right.
So
You,
so
you,
I,
you, know,
it's
you drive the business into the ground or you retire. And it's like, well, what if I'm not ready?
right.
What if the business needs me? What if I don't have a number 2 lieutenant that's good at siege warfare?
Yeah.
I got to be a big boy and adult and figure this out, even though it's not my natural inclination.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you see this a lot with founders, right? The
Yeah,
sort of
the
dynamic, and they're
founder's
really good
trap.
at that.
Yeah,
Right, the founder's trap, right? And they can't transition into being the kind of managers that a company needs once it's past its founding stage and is becoming more mature. And I always think that's kind of sad, because
yeah,
you would think you would want to see your baby grow up, mature,
yeah,
and go on to.
yeah. There's more work to do.
Yeah.
Bill Gates did that successfully. He was not naturally
Hmm.
a leader of men. Mark Zuckerberg has done it. He's not naturally a leader of men. Uh,
Hmm.
but it is the exception to the rule, right? There is a
Hmm.
thing. There is a founder's trap, and there's a reason that there's a founder's trap. And I think it's a lack of humility on the founder's part to say, uh, I was good. I ran the baton. I got my money. It's time for me to bail, rather than saying, look, I have a duty and responsibility to become something that I'm not naturally good at. I'll surround myself with a team. I'll have a number two like Sherman that's good and that can complement my weaknesses. But at the end of the day, I was given command of this thing, and I'm going to fight it out until I'm relieved of command.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
So that's Vicksburg. That's just one
Yeah.
campaign of Grant's many campaigns that in this 6-month period, guy, there's so much we can learn about leadership from what he did. Or maybe he's an example of leadership principles that apply everywhere. And we just can see it in the military context.
Yeah. Well, and I think not just leadership, right? Well, I guess maybe personal growth is perhaps is a form of self leadership, I guess
Yeah.
you could call it.
Mm-hmm.
But right, I think there's there's lessons beyond leadership for us there about how we need to be as human beings.
Yeah.
One of the things you mentioned that I think is very powerful is, again, we hear a lot from leadership coaches about you have to delegate, and that's true, because a lot of leaders, their Achilles heel is they won't let go, right? But I think you rightly pointed out, what we need to do is not delegate. It's understand how much needs to be delegated, when we need to delegate, what are the boundaries on that delegation, so people understand the situation in which they're operating and can do so effectively, without having to worry that either they're going to cross some boundary that they didn't really know existed, or that they don't have enough authority to get done the task that's been set for them. And that's a more complex thing to do than just delegating.
Yep. War is hard, and running a business is hard.
Mm-hmm.
And there is cost and pain in both. Certainly more in war than in business, but
Yeah.
there are awesome principles and lessons to be learned by being a student of war and finding the application in our day to day.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we've gone a little bit over time here, but I wanted to finish this out. This was just fantastic. I'm gonna have to maybe make you a regular feature. Have you come in periodically?
As long as we stick with Grant, I'm good.
Okay. Well,
maybe maybe we'll do Napoleon, but mostly Grant.
Okay. Well, you know what? Grant had a long and illustrious career.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And one of these days, I might have to get you to talk about, how did his drinking get him to be a more effective leader?
Right.
Right. Because there's the famous quote from Lincoln where they were complaining about Grant being drunk, and Lincoln said something along the lines of, "Well, find out what he's drinking so I can send it to the rest of my commanders."
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Well, Josh, thank you so much. That was really, really terrific. I appreciate it.
It's fun.
I'm just going to wrap things up here, and I'll take us off live, and we can wrap up one-on-one. So, folks, thank you very much for tuning in. I really appreciate it. What a treat it was to have Josh on the show today. So I just want to remind you that tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, Business Lessons from the Military. That'll wrap things up for this week. And then next week, we start again on Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific time with Trusts and Estates Weekly. So that's our lineup. And of course, 7 days from today, we'll be back with the next edition of Business Lessons from the Military. So I thank you very much for tuning in, wishing you a wonderful rest of the day, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you're my belle, especially since you come from the South. All the best, folks.